Good morning, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the PPA's monthly webinar series. For those of you who are joining for the first time, we do this monthly webinar on the first Tuesday of each month at 9 a.m. We have a wide range of presenters that participate in this series. We have companies like the Rawls Group, who are members of our association. We also have government officials come in and present, or different government agencies present on different topics that impact your business on the regulatory side and or legislative side. So if it's your first time joining us, thank you for being here. If you've been here, you joined us before, thanks for joining us again. Before we get started, I have a couple quick housekeeping items just like to go over. All of our attendees today are going to be on mute. You can still, we still encourage you to interact with our presenter today, and you can do that by using the question feature in GoToWebinar. Essentially, just type your question, and once we get to the end of the presentation today, I will moderate that back to Dan. And if for some reason we run out of time, or if you have a more personal question that you want to just connect with Dan on after the fact, you can absolutely do that. But please keep that in mind. We've done this now for over 5 years, or close to 5 years, for this webinar series, and we always appreciate the ones that have some back and forth between the audience and our presenters. So please ask questions. I'm going to introduce our speaker and our topic this morning. The topic is adapting and thriving, how family-owned energy marketers are overcoming challenges and maintaining control. Before I introduce Dan, our speaker, we are always looking for relevant content for these webinars, and I think as a lot of you who are joining us today know that our industry is a very generational business. We have members that are third, fourth, fifth generation, and you know, the topic of succession planning is, in my opinion, extremely important, and we're happy to welcome the Rawls Group as a member of our association who really specializes in this space. And I'm looking forward to what Dan has to present here today. So with that being said, I'm going to introduce Dan Iosu. Yep. I think I got it, Dan. Yeah. Dan is a succession planner for the Rawls Group, and Dan, I will pass it off to you.
Thanks, Ted. Very much appreciate the opportunity to be here, with you and with everyone who's joining us this morning. So, thanks for taking some time on a Tuesday morning to get together and have what is hopefully a discussion. It's a little difficult in webinar format, but so please do ask questions. But in any event, I appreciate everyone taking the time to join us this morning. What we're going to talk about, overall is, as you can see here, you're creating a winning game plan. And what does that really mean? For us, a big part of that can be summed up in the phrase, professionalizing an organization. And that's I'll get into more about that. But ultimately, what we're talking about in professionalizing an organization is the creation and implementation of more structure. Why structure? It's, for us, it's all about the purpose of what we're doing when we're doing something. And with structure, it ultimately facilitates a more effective communication. It facilitates awareness, self-awareness and what our intentions are as a business, and what our intentions are as leaders. And it creates an opportunity for more effective communication around that, and ultimately, clarifies expectations. And the outcome of working through that process creates, in our experience, more effective teamwork, and ultimately a scalable process and procedure that better positions, any business more or less for growth, or to withstand challenging business and family circumstances, and ultimately better positions the business to survive and thrive in the future. So to back up, just I guess briefly on me, I got an educational background in psychology and organizational leadership. I am a succession planner with the Rawls Group. I've been, with the group as a practitioner, working with clients is what I do, almost every day of the week. Been working with the Rawls Group for about 8 years now. I've got a professional background in marketing, sales, and finance before getting involved with succession planning. As a firm, I think it's important just to pause and give you a little bit of our perspective on succession planning. We define succession as the continuation of success through the next generation of leaders and owners. So that's a very important distinction, because success through the next generation involves, many transactional, components of setting a business up, to transact, to the next generation. But success through that generation requires working hands-on in areas of what we call leadership and management development, the business structure, the business performance, getting successors, identified and prepared to lead, working through in great detail strategic planning to facilitate, hey, where do we want to go? How do we want to get there? What resources do we want to dedicate? And then, of course, many of our clients, most of our clients are family owned. And I'll get a little more into that later on. And so with that comes the beauty and the complication of family in the business. And so governance around that and working through relationship challenges among and between the family is an important part of what we do. So for today, as I've already mentioned, we'll focus on what you can do and some of the things that we work through to create more structure in professionalizing the business. Creating a development game plan, and what we're really talking about there is people. Growth, sustainability, continuity is about the people, and I would encourage you to embrace the reality that most of us are in the people business, regardless of the product. Creating an attractive culture. In our experience as practitioners, culture is either implied or it is intentional. What I mean by implied is the culture of any group will take on what the leader or leadership group is role modeling. Right? So if they're not expressing intentionally what the culture is, what are the values, what's important, then the group will take on what is assumed about the culture and about the leadership. We'll talk a little bit about a clear strategic vision and what that means to us as it relates to creating a sustainable organization that's better positioned to survive and thrive, right, in a challenging circumstance or growth or through succession. And really, that's for us, that's kind of all of the above when it comes to succession. This is an acronym that I like to use because I think a lot of what we do and talk about comes down to these three key critical areas, and that is awareness, communication, and expectations. So ACE for short. As I've already mentioned, awareness, whether it's self-awareness or awareness of others, awareness of the position of our business as it relates to the current environment and what we expect in the future. And then communication, more effective communication, specifically about many different things in many different areas, which we'll talk about. And then expectations. I can't express, I think, emphatically enough how often assumptions that people are making are clouding relationships, they're clouding business performance, they're clouding roles and responsibilities, because people do not have a clear understanding and agreed upon understanding of what the expectations are of them and of each other. So professionalizing the family business on the On the people side, we're talking about communication, more effective professional relationships, more effective command and control. On the culture side, we're talking about implied culture versus expressed culture. And strategically, on the strategic planning side, we're talking about the creation and expression of what the vision is for the future, the creation and expression of what the mission is for the future, so how we're going to get where we want to go, what our purpose is in doing what we're doing, and then what's important along the way, the values, what we're not going to sacrifice along the way, and what we're going to prioritize. So starting with family, as I mentioned, almost all of our, well, I would say all of our businesses that we work with are family owned. And I think it's important to consider the definition or how we define family. And we have a broader definition of family than I think what most people have. And that is, we define family as people who are, two or more people who are in business for reasons beyond money. I mean, certainly, most of us are in business, for profit, and that is an integral part of why we come to work each day. But ultimately, in doing what I do, I could go do it somewhere else. I could go do something different somewhere else. I mean, we have, in my opinion, free will, and I choose, to work with the Rawls Group for many different reasons. But I would put most of those in the category of family. And so in managing or in working in any family business or owning and operating any family business, there's an inherent contradiction between family and business. On the family side, we've got what should be relationships based on unconditional love. In a perfect world, anyway, unconditional love, regardless of some of the things that you may or may not do. Right. On the business side, it's all about conditional performance. What have you done for me lately? It's about the bottom line, and it's about profit. And so there are a bunch of different ways to skin this cat. There isn't anything wrong with being overly balanced, as we would call it, or tilted towards family, or tilted towards business. And what I mean by that is, oftentimes a first generation family business is built, by putting one foot in front of the other, and we involve family because they are readily available and interested, just natural participants in the business, and when we combine conditional performance and driving performance on the business end with those family dynamics and relationships, things get complicated pretty quickly. And oftentimes what we run into in first generation and second generation businesses is that they are, they have grown organically, and they have gotten to where they are today through that family perspective, which is a beautiful thing. But that skew towards family as it relates to going into the next generation, the second, the third, especially the fourth, requires a rebalancing towards business. Not a tilt, but a rebalancing. And I think you never quite get it right, but it's the striving for that balance and that awareness that a balance is necessary. That's what's important. And in leveling the seesaw there towards business, what we're really talking about is professionalizing the organization. We're talking about more structure. We're talking about defined processes and procedures. We're talking about well-defined roles and responsibilities, governance structures in place to facilitate, document, facilitate, and reinforce the processes and procedures. And again, it's not about having the structure in place, it's about the purpose of it, which is really to provide more effective communication, again, right? And more awareness of the necessity to balance. So weighing a business down, particularly a privately owned, closely held, family, as we define family-owned business, we don't get called in to work on many things that are easy. Hopefully, we're not called in to the burning building while it's on fire, which does happen. There's been some sort of triggering event, and somebody's passed away, somebody's gotten sick, new family members have come into the business, and it's not going well, and we're engaged as a resource to help guide, help navigate through that specific circumstance. And of course, we end up reaching into these other areas as it relates to succession planning. And so what we see in weighing a business down when we initially get involved is typically on the relationship side. There are oftentimes structural shareholder agreements and operating agreements that are also maybe not current or aligned with the client's goals, but really where the heavier lifting or carrying the elephant on the back is on the relationship side, and particularly when it comes to family and the business and the next generation. So some of the things that we see there are along the lines of behavior and attitude. We use an acronym to describe what we look for in a successor candidate or a strong successor leader. And the acronym is BASKET: behavior, attitude, skills, knowledge, experience, and training. And some of those, the majority of them, are sort of tangible, check the box type items, right? They're important. They take some time, to develop skills. Take some time to develop knowledge. We can shortcut some of that, but these are very sort of curriculum-driven things that can be addressed. The experience, we can shortcut some of that, but we need to have experience and the necessary training involved. But the elephant on the back of the business typically is along the lines of the behavioral side and the attitude side. What's the perspective on what we're doing and how we're treating each other? How are we acting? And I'm not specifically talking about the next generation of family or leaders. I'm talking about both the next generation and the current generation. How are we approaching that interaction? And there are a couple of things there that are necessary to vet through and work through. And one of them is for the next generation to develop respect from others in the organization, mutual respect of others in the organization. And that's not something that can be shortcutted very easily. It needs some structure, it needs some clarity, and it needs for the next generation to roll their sleeves up and put in some hard work alongside their colleagues and their subordinates and their superiors, and who will someday they will have to rely upon for success. And on the flip side of that, for successors, pretty often they come in and they are put into a role if there's one open, or they're kind of given something to do, and they're not really sure what's next, and they're kind of doing the best that they can with what they've got, but there's not a whole lot of clarity around that. And they're in the shadow of their fathers or mothers footsteps, which are often pretty large shadows. And that in and of itself is something to work through with some intentional effort. So that's some of the things that we see as driving motivators for why we work to professionalize a business that we work, any business that we are engaged with. So specifically, what are some of the strategies that you can employ? It's one thing to kind of talk about what the issues are and highlight, if you will, some of the overarching challenges. And it's one thing to say that communication needs to be improved. It's another to actually improve it. One of our partners at the Rawls Group loves to say, and I've adopted this, is the funny thing about communication is that people think it exists. Now, oftentimes we're saying one thing and whoever we're saying it to is hearing another. And that has to do with personality more than personal or who people are, in our experience anyway. And so one of the ways that we navigate that is by leveraging behavioral science. And that's, I guess, sort of a fancy term for saying personality indexes or profiles. You may have heard of predictive index or DISC profiles. Myers-Briggs is a kind of an older example of one. We use one called ProScan. It's a very effective tool. It's efficient to use, doesn't take a whole lot of time to actually complete the assessment. But what we use it for is to align personalities and to develop an understanding of who we are and how we prefer to go about our day as individuals. And then, once we have understood that in a way that allows us to understand how others hear and behave, then we start moving the needle from a leadership standpoint and leveraging our time as leaders and managers. So I'll give you a quick example. On that would be someone who is extroverted, very extroverted, in dealing with someone who's very introverted, right? Someone who's more of an internal thinker. Someone who's extroverted is going to want to talk about ideas out loud, going to want to work through things before they're fully thought out and kind of fully formulated. Someone who's an internal thinker is going to need a little more time typically to think through things, maybe put some things on paper and really formulate their thoughts into kind of a finished product, if you will, before they put them on the table for vetting. And and they're sensitive to typically that personality is sensitive to how that discussion goes and how and the vetting process of what they have to say. Whereas the external thinker is more put it out there and just want to work through it and talk through it. And so these that's a very basic example of personality differences, but you'd be amazed at how many times siblings who've known each other obviously a lifetime. And I've got a specific example. I was working with a brother and sister who are sisters in their 50s, brothers in his 40s. They've both been working in the business for over 20 years. And when we first started working together, mom and dad were hesitant to select one as the successor leader. And we worked through a process that basically positioned them to make that decision. The brother and sister. It's called Bob and Susie. And so, but on the behavioral side and the communication side, Susie very outgoing, very dominant, very low sense of patience, like get it done yesterday. Her brother Bob, pretty much the exact opposite. More of a team player type collaborative approach, an internal thinker, very patient and deliberate and process oriented. And once we laid out, hey, here are the personality differences, and here's the way that Susie, when you say something, here's the way that Ben hears it, or Bob hears it, and vice versa. And so Bob may need some more time to think, to work through something you're asking him to do. And on the other hand, Bob, when Susie asks, wants to get something done, she's expecting it done yesterday. So leaning on the ProScan as a tool to put those types of relationship dynamics on the table in a facilitated, constructive way was able to defuse a lot of relationships or pitfalls and side roads. Another one here, management to leadership education and coaching. This is a big one, and it's not just for successors. I know I've been talking a lot about, kind of family successors and the next generation from that standpoint, but the management to leadership education and coaching, pretty typically what we run into is managers, we're good at doing something technical or administrative, and because they were good at their job, whatever that was, installing, HVAC systems, because they're good at that and they're reliable and they've got all those things you look for in a good employee. They get promoted into management. Well, all of a sudden in management, it has a lot less to do with what you're doing technically every day, right? Doing the job, and it has to do with managing others and getting them to do the job appropriately, in the way that, according to expectations, and most of the time, 9 times out of 10, managers in that position have never had any type of training or significant training on how to influence, how to lead people, how to manage from a position that's not about, their title, and that is do as I say because I'm the manager. It has to do with, managing through influence and showing others how to be more productive through your own production, and then eventually an evolution into leadership where you've got influence and followers, right, who are doing the things that you expect for them to do when you're not necessarily looking, right? So you don't have to look over their shoulders all the time. You're looking back to see what they're doing. It's trust but verify, but you've got leverage as a leader. So education and coaching along those lines greatly improves, the organizational communication. Yeah, because once your management team starts picking up on that, they start leading with abundance instead of fear, and developing, people underneath them that have the competency and capacity to, as up and coming managers and leaders, right? Which is what you want. We'll talk a little bit more about that. The clarification of reasonable expectations. So we have specifically, we have a process that we call the development of covenants. So an agreement between unequal parties. And this has to do with working through expectations of each other. We do this on a specific way of doing this on an individual basis before we get more than one person together to talk about what those expectations are. But we clarify, put them on paper and work through what's reasonable, what's not, as far as, what you can expect of each other, what a father can expect of a son, as an employee in a business, as a leader in the business, as a son, and then vice versa. What the son can expect from his dad, as a father. We're spend some time not talking about business outside of business, and as a leader and as a manager. So, the clarification of reasonable expectations, cuts off what people are assuming, and assumptions lead to disconnections and disagreements, in our experience. So this is it sounds relatively straightforward, this clarification or creation, reasonable expectations, but it's not necessarily fun to work on, but just the process in and of itself, really moves the needle when it comes to relationships. Facilitated forums. So there are a number of these, but again, this comes back to professionalizing the organization. An example of a facilitated forum would be an operating board of directors. When I say that, it sounds like that could be, overkill in governance, but at its very basic level, it's a formalized, table, if you will, for ownership to sit at to discuss strategic decision making in the business and future direction, and address all sorts of issues and items that are related to the ownership and leadership of the organization. And particularly if there's only one owner involved, when we first get involved, something like this has not been necessary. But when we talk about success forward through the next generation, and positioning, and it's not just success with the next generation, but by position, I should mention this, by positioning a business to be successful through the next generation, you are adding value today. Right? If you take that business to market, the business is worth, it's anticipated forward earnings. And so, the better positioned a business is through the next, to be successful through the next generation, the better position it is today. And we see that on the buy-sell side, on the mergers and acquisition side, and many of you have probably experienced it yourself. So that would be an example of a forum, another forum that there are a lot of different names for this, but we put together management advisory boards or groups, to work on strategic initiatives and sort of cross departmental communication and relationships, kind of a tribe within multiple tribes within business of your key leaders and your key people. So that's another example of a forum that we work to facilitate that anyone can put together. And then of course governance agreements, having up-to-date, well-drafted, well-formulated, clear governance agreements that are aligned with your goals, as business owners, as leaders. That ideally these agreements never have to come out of a filing cabinet or the virtual filing folder, but they clearly outline all of the decision making behind where we're going, triggering events, when it comes to the next generation, first right of refusal, those sorts of things. So clearly created, expressed and understood governance agreements that are aligned with your goals is an important part of professionalizing the business and ultimately making it more resilient. On the creation of a developmental game plan for people, through any transition or preparation, for transition, we sort of have three categories here that we're talking about when it comes to intentional development. We've got successors, who's going to lead the business in the next through the next generation, and then we'll talk a little more about who they're going to rely upon, to help them. But then what's your bench strength like? Right? We've got, I'm sure, a group of key people who are responsible for the success you've had up until now and who are important in the success you're going to have going forward in the near term and hopefully long term. But when it comes to the long term, what does that look like? Are we developing people with the capacity and capability to lead and manage effectively, underneath our core group currently in place? And that takes a culture of vulnerability, right? I mean, when there's a culture of scarcity, I think managers, and look, this could happen regardless of the culture, but certainly predominantly managers will operate from with scarcity in mind if that's the culture that's the tone that's set by leadership. They're worried about who's going to replace them, then focused on growing the pie. It's not about, hey, we can only cut this pie in so many slices, and then as we continue to cut slices and bring people up and in, my slice gets smaller. That would be scarcity and fear, as opposed to, hey, we'll bring more people in and we'll just grow the size of the pie. And the focus is on the growth, not the keeping people, from development. So that's the bench strength side of things. And then on the, particularly as it relates to a family business, the key leader succession bridge would be, if we've got, Bobby Smith is, in his 20s, and it's going to take him another 10 years before he's really ready to lead and operate effectively as an owner. If something were to happen in between the time when he or she is ready, then we need someone who is prepared and affirmed and ready to roll to bridge that gap, and also incentivized properly to stay, if something were to happen. So there's a very specific process for working through that, documenting it, creating the incentives, and bringing that key leader to the table in a communication forum like an operating board of directors, for example. So what holds successors back? I think I mentioned some of this already, but I mean, more times than not, it's not knowing what they're going to do next. It's not knowing what they're really expected of, what is expected of them now, and what they can do to determine, improve, if you will, earn their success. And on the optimistic side, I work with a lot of folks in the next generation who are, they are highly motivated to become very good at what they do and to become good leaders. There's just not a whole lot of clarity around how to do that. And sometimes this has to do with something kind of as straightforward as birth order. If we've got an older brother in the business and a younger sister in the business, what if the younger sister is really better equipped to someday be the CEO? How do we manage through that so that we keep relationships intact? And I mentioned earlier, it's how do we position them to earn the respect of the managers and just the people in the organization. I've got one story that comes to mind, just a quick story that in working with a fairly large, large business, it's $500 million in top line revenue. So, large, mid-sized business, I should say. But, multiple layers of management, 600-700 employees, there's some complexity there. And in part of what we do, we interview key managers one-on-one when we do our gap analysis kind of on the front end of our work. And to a person, every key manager and executive in the organization, their number one fear is, what if something happens to the owner and the kids are in control? I mean, the number was unanimous, and they were all equally clear that they would leave, that there was no light at the end of that tunnel for them. And I think, on the outside looking in, a lot of businesses that don't prepare, to transition right through the next generation, that's exactly what happens. There's an entitlement in the next generation. There's enablement of the next generation. Something happens, they step in, and they're not prepared. And part of being not prepared is they have not earned the respect of the key people in the organization, right? And so even under the best of circumstances, and I mean, even under the best of business circumstances, that's a difficult environment to come in as a successor and navigate a business that has probably grown significantly, from the time that their parent started the business, and so many more people are involved. And so even under good business conditions, that's challenging. Then you mix in some sort of outlying event, COVID, 2008. I mean, we can name 10 of them in the past 20 years. That's a pretty quick recipe for a fire sale, right? Closing of the business or selling at a discount, right? So those are some of the typical, sort of overarching themes we see in what holds successors back. On the bench strength side, without the intentional identification and focus of who are your high potential, next up and comers, let's just put it that way, and then what opportunities are we creating for them to develop and to grow? There's a balance there too, right? But ideally, we're kind of bursting at the seams with a strong bench, because that positions us for a contingency event. Like, what if something happens to one of our key people? We've got the next person up, ready to roll, and then but ultimately creates options for the future, and whether that's through acquisition, expansion, and into new regions, new centers of operation, or sale, right? If we've got key people and we've got the bench beneath them, then we're better positioned for future earnings, and I think that's identifiable on the buy sell side. So some of the developmental strategies to consider here would be so FME employment policies. So that's an acronym for family member employment policies, and this is something that's relatively straightforward but important to have, I think, well thought out and documented in black and white. Family member employees are in a fishbowl, for better or for worse. They are looked at by everyone in the organization differently, and it's got certainly its advantages and certainly its disadvantages. So developing an employment policy, here's what it takes to come in as an employee. 2 years working outside the business, where your name doesn't mean much. Right? You're just, excuse me, any other employee, you are the same as any other employee. Right? Figuring out what it's like to show up day to day to kind of earn your keep. To behavioral expectations, how they might have to dress differently. It just helps to clarify these things up front, so they're not making assumptions, and vice versa. This is a big one: successor curriculums. So what is the roadmap? This is, I think, as I mentioned before, one of the biggest challenges to the next gen is, where do I go from here? How does that work? And then on the ownership side, how do we create space? We don't want to create positions, but how do we create a roadmap with the flexibility in it to accommodate our real world circumstances? One of our clients in the oil and gas business they're relatively flat, and when it comes to the next generation, we can't just have them changing roles every 4 months necessarily. They're create too much chaos within the group. But also, how do we give them the exposure they need in these different areas? Not just to shadow, but to be doing something, to learn, what's important about, gas piping, and also, as I mentioned before, this is a big part of earning the respect of their peers, is working alongside them and really understanding, the different types of people it takes to be successful in different areas of the business. So a successor curriculum, lays that roadmap out, 3 to 5 years is I think a pretty good goal, with the flexibility built in, from a timing standpoint, to move some things around. For your leadership and management team and the bench strength and your successor candidates, a 360-degree leadership assessment is a fairly simple tool to deploy. It's a leadership assessment that's sent out to subordinates, peers, and superiors. It's anonymous and asks a multitude of questions along the lines of their current leadership capability and capacity, and that's a good tool to benchmark where someone is at the moment. I talked about the pro scans earlier. That's the behavioral science end, and really leveraging those, not just for communication, but certainly that I think that is, well, for us, it's a big priority, but also for hiring. Once you become familiar with these assessments, you can create, job model profiles and profile candidates for key positions to understand, their personalities and where they're coming from and how they best would fit within your team. Conflict resolution coaching. There's a lot to this. Without going into a ton of detail for the sake of time, the reluctance to create conflict is a key inhibitor to communicating effectively. But if we've gone through as a group and learned how to navigate conflict with success and understand that it's okay, we may not look to create conflict, but we're willing to work through issues that can create friction without fear that friction turns to conflict, because we have confidence as a group that we can work through it and get to the other side. Talked about covenants. That's creating and clarifying reasonable expectations of each other. Not just between, I talked about father-son, but this could be between certainly key managers, key manager to key manager to successors, key manager to owners. There are a lot of different ways to deploy that. The key part there is clarifying expectations in a very concrete way. And then advisory forums. I talked about briefly about the management advisory forum, and quick example of that. We're going to mention just briefly strategic planning as it relates to positioning the business for success in the future. But an advisory forum, like a management advisory board, we've got a client whose motivation, whose succession plan was through their key managers, no family in the next generation. Highly successful business, blessed with capital to deploy and redeploy. But what really is their motivation? One motivation is their key team and in creating opportunities for their key people to grow. And so this management advisory board was created, and the key managers, along with ownership, drove the strategic planning process to identify how they want to grow, what ways in which they're willing to grow, and how they want to get there, what resources they're willing to deploy. And in doing so, they've taken what was already a highly successful business and literally tripled the size of the business in 7 or 8 years. It's a tremendous success story along those lines, and it's been so successful that now this group has platforms of businesses in different regions now, and each of those platforms has leaders that were part of the organic original advisory board. So now they're doing their own advisory boards with their platforms to do the same thing or something similar. Another advisory forum will be a successor advisory board, a group of the next generation leaders, to start working together on strategic thinking, on interacting with a leadership team in a strategic way, on structured strategic items to bring to the table for growth and opportunity. On the culture side, as mentioned, there is either implied or expressed culture. And for us, a winning culture is one that prioritizes and values collaboration and teamwork, and fosters and embraces meaningful contributions, and builds, as you can see, mutual trust, rewards performance, and rewards collaboration and teamwork. And as practitioners, that's what we see work well. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to do this, of course, but we really see that work well. And there is a lot of behavioral science to back that up for the past 40 years as far as what motivates people. And the people, most people, productive people, and employees and managers, they value collaboration and teamwork. They want to contribute. They want to win. They enjoy being on a winning team, and so part of that expression of culture is driven through a clear vision and strategic priorities. Right? Oftentimes, the first generation, they know they're walking, talking, living, breathing mission, vision, values. Like they know it. They're driving it in everything that they do. Sometimes they have clarified it, put it on paper, it's hanging on the wall. And it's not just as a perfunctory thing, they're driving roles and responsibilities through that lens. But oftentimes that hasn't been clarified and communicated. So how do we leverage what that culture has been, that successful culture, and ensure that we've got that continuing through the next generation, through growth? Well, that's through strategic planning, and in a very effective, practical way. And the group I mentioned earlier, who's tripled the size of their business through it, and that's exactly how they've done it. Without a strategic plan, our founding partner Lloyd likes to say, this is like an old country song. We don't know where we're going, but we're making great time. What we see is, it's hard enough to focus on working on the business with getting pulled in all these different directions, right? Fluctuating oil prices, outlying events, economic downturns, getting pulled left and right. And some of those are both urgent and important. But a lot of the things that pull us sideways, in any given day seem like they're urgent, and they may be urgent, but they're not necessarily important. Not as important as the purpose, the North Star, the guiding light, the vision for the business, and then what we have committed to doing along the way, how we're going to get to where we see this business going, what we're willing to dedicate, people in resources, people, time, and money, and what we're not willing, to sacrifice. And how do we know when it's time to change course? Well, if we're thinking, and not just thinking communicating and working strategically on the business in a facilitated way through a forum, through a team, then we have clarified these things up front, and we have a process in place for revisiting how we're getting where we want to go. And that's and what I mean specifically through the in doing that is that creation and clarification of the purpose. What is Disney's purpose? Disney's purpose is to create happiness. They're a great example. They have a more detailed mission of how they go about that, but their overarching purpose, and it's been the same since I think the early 60s, is to create happiness. Everything they do in every business line that they have is regardless of what you may or may not think with Disney lately, but their purpose is to create happiness. So determining what you want and how you want to get there, and then having building a team around that of key people who are going to get together and help vet out, like, pull apart the mission, vision, purpose, reconstruct it or affirm it, because in doing so they're bought in, they're a part of it. So that's that affirmation of mission, vision, values. And then through the strategic planning process, talk about what you do well. What do we do well? Let's talk about what are our strengths, and then what could we do differently. And there are probably, if you get together in most strategic planning sessions, there are a bunch of different things you could do differently. But the question is, what 3 or 4 do you want to focus on, given that all of us have limited resources? What 3 or 4 do you want to focus on to move the needle? And then let's put a very specific action plan in place to focus on each of those initiatives. And with a timeline, we're going to get together every quarter, whatever it is. There's accountability and follow-up. We're just not getting together for a weekend or a day, going through mission, vision, values, and a SWOT analysis, and then it kind of lays where it lays. That happens a lot. So I mentioned, where do you want to dedicate resources, and then plan for it, specifically execute the plan and revisit. Sounds simple, but surprisingly, it's most businesses do not go about it this way. So certainly it's not the majority. So just to revisit, quickly I know I've kind of talked a lot, but that's why I'm here. We talk about professionalizing the family business, creating that intentional development plan for your people, your successors, your key team, clarifying what that is, laying it out for them so people know. And that becomes an attractive place to work. The word spreads when you've got a culture, an attractive culture that has initiatives in place to develop people like that. We've seen it happen. And then with that clear strategic vision, everyone rowing in the boat, same direction, same cadence. And then take it back. You take it all. If you remember one thing, and we'll have one takeaway. You can take, I think, all of this, distill it down to increased awareness, effective communication, and clarifying expectations. So I know I'm up on time. But with that said, I just want to thank those of you that joined us and stayed with us. I very much appreciate it. And if you've got any questions, certainly now or after the fact, feel free to reach out to myself, Kendall Rawls on our team, or Ted. I'm sure can put any one of y'all in touch with us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. Just a reminder for anyone that got on late, you do have the ability, if you do want to ask a question here before we wrap up. To Dan's point, I know, or at least I assume, that the topic of succession planning is certainly a personal one, for each business. So Dan and Kendall are certainly available if you would like to speak to them directly. If you do want to do that, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be happy to connect you with them. We do have a hard stop at 10, but I have a question, Dan. Just if you could, I see this with our membership. There's, I think, a somewhat small percentage that currently exists, but how many of your clients have a board of directors within their organization? Can you give a rough, regardless of the industry, can you give a rough percentage on that?
Yes. So by far the majority, when we first get involved have a perfunctory board in place. It's part of the, they have to, it's part of their perfunctory shareholders agreements, have a board, but most of them are not functional. So I would say a rough number would be 10 to 15% have a functioning operating board of directors in place when we engage. And maybe so somewhere around 15%, maybe 20. And by that, so that number, by the time we're finished, sort of working through the heavy lifting in our process, the implementation phase, which takes a couple of years, they have a functional board of directors in place, and there are a lot of different shades of gray to that, a lot of different ways to do it. Very few of those boards involve outside members. Those that do requires just a more robust governance. So some boards certainly do, and there's a functional purpose for that. But so Ted, did that answer your question?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, you did. Thank you. And I think that's probably a pretty close percentage to what we see within our industry. So, okay. Up here, Dan, again, I really appreciate your time and expertise on the topic. For all of our attendees this morning, thank you for joining us. And like I said, if you do want to get in touch with Dan or the Rawls Group, please feel free to reach out to me and I'll be happy to make that connection. With that being said, I hope everyone has a great rest of the day, and thank you.
Thank you.